Buying a home can feel overwhelming, especially when you're not sure who to trust. Lane works as your advocate in the mortgage process, helping you understand your choices and avoid costly mistakes. From first time buyers to homeowners looking to refinance, his goal is simple: help you make the right move. Call or text Lane at 618-671-1830 to get started. Again, that's 618-671-1830. NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance, NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now on to the episode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us in other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, you can become a patron by heading over to patreon.com/The Particular Baptist. Okay, so now we dive into a mini series, if you will, that I'm going to be doing, focusing on the life and legacy, I guess, of some notable Particular Baptist signers. I guess I was focusing on the Second London, but who knows? We might branch out into the First London or any others. But I want to focus on some profiles of Particular Baptist pioneers, if you will. And I want to start with William Kiffen. So basically looking at the life of Kiffen at a very, very brief high level. This isn't some sort of long lecture on church history as it relates to William Kiffen, but I want to hit some historical points and then talk about some lessons that we can pull from his life and, looking at his legacy, I guess. But Kiffen is one of the biggest names in Particular Baptist history. You will see him come up again and again in various Particular Baptist writings and confessional writings. Just, he seems to always be there in Particular Baptist history. He has some touch point as it relates to major events happening in Particular Baptist history. And so it would be negligent, I think, to not talk about him as if we're talking about Particular Baptist history in general, because of the importance and role that he played in their development in England, as they were trying to fight for survival and trying to fight for legitimacy in the eyes of the civil government. Kiffen was born in London in 1616, and he came from basically nothing. He didn't have privilege, wealth. His parents didn't have really anything. He was born in a very poor family. And it's really interesting when you look at him later on and what he became, and you see the stark contrast of where he came from. He came from poverty, but he worked his way up and was able to become the strong Particular Baptist leader that would be key in bringing the Particular Baptist to really fruition, if you will, throughout the 17th century. Federal Theology, thank you, brother, so much for the super chat. And I hope you're doing well, brother. And thanks for tuning in. Again, thanks for the super chat. I really appreciate that. But yeah, William Kiffen came from nothing, but really would go and become the leader that Particular Baptists needed. It really took resilience. It took tenacity and perseverance for Particular Baptists to get to where they were confessionally, to stay unified as much as they could, considering all the trouble that happened among Particular Baptists, some of them, kind of falling off to the wayside and denying orthodoxy, most notably with Thomas Collier. But again, Kiffen staying true, staying focused, staying consistent. That's one thing about Kiffen that you see throughout the 17th century, his life and work in Particular Baptist history, is his consistency, his unchangeableness as it relates to his, those core tenets of particular Baptist faith and the faith in general. So he was born in 1616. Both his parents actually died of the plague in 1625 when he was 9 years old. So he was orphaned as a very young child, and he was not left with much, but he kind of found his way into the trades. He became an apprentice of a brewer, which I thought was kind of funny. So, particular Baptists, I guess early on they, liked alcohol apparently. Of course, this is before he was a Baptist, but it's just kind of funny. As Baptists uh, generally tend to be very anti-alcohol, but you do see this kind of this historical note about Kiffen becoming a brewer and being in the alcohol trade, so to speak, and later became a Baptist. Just kind of ironic and funny, I guess. But this seemed to have got him into the trades. And then he later would come under the teaching of John Goodwin, who was an independent. Remember, independents, they were those who they were separatists from the Church of England, but they didn't believe in any kind of state church. They believed that local churches that were independent from the state was the biblical ecclesiastical model, right? So that's where you have John Owen, Thomas Goodwin, who is part of the Westminster Assembly and co-author with John Owen of the Savoy Declaration. You do see a strong independent movement. And of course, particular Baptists, I guess they could roughly fall under the independent movement simply because of the fact that they believed in local churches that were not under some sort of hierarchy like a presbytery or state church. And I guess the independence would have been for independent local churches, even outside of a synod or a presbytery. They're outside of any kind of ecclesiastical authority over a group of churches. Each church was its own authority as submitting to Christ as the head of the church. And so, you would see Baptists, particular Baptists, falling under this type of ecclesiology in a sense. Of course, there were plenty of independents who weren't Baptists, that they were Paedo-Baptists like John Owen and like Thomas Goodwin, but you do see a common structure in ecclesiology there. So Kiffen becomes a Baptist. Kiffen would face quite a bit of persecution at the civil level because, after becoming a Baptist, for instance, it's possible he became a Baptist through John Spilsbury, who was a prominent particular Baptist later on with Kiffen. But Kiffen would go to prison. He was prosecuted for blasphemy and heresy for saying that infant baptism is unlawful. He got in trouble with the state for that. And the ordinance that he was tried under, that he was prosecuted under, was implemented in the Commons and restricted publishing things such as atheism and denying core tenets of the faith, such as the deity of Christ and the resurrection, and apparently preaching against infant baptism. This was basically like a light of nations concept, like we've talked about before with like Christopher Blackwood, his Light of Nations. There's this common religious understanding of certain things, and so the state is enforcing those cultural Christian things, if you will, like the importance of sound doctrine in order to keep civil order. So there seems to be that. Of course, they're enforcing certain things that are unbiblical, like infant baptism. But you do see the Light of Nations concept there. This would have been in 1655 that he would have been prosecuted under this. And it's interesting, too, side note, that Kiffen was prosecuted under this ordinance along with John Biddle, Dr. John Biddle, who was a leading Socinian, who was actually a heretic. And, he denied the Trinity. And I think he was prosecuted for basically denying the deity of Christ, blaspheming Christ. But it's interesting that Kiffen, who was Orthodox, was prosecuted along with Biddle, who was actually unorthodox. So there's some interesting irony there, I guess, and stark contrast. But there is a document that you can actually um, read that kind of lays out the charges against both of them that were under this ordinance, and they were put in the same document talking about what they were being prosecuted for. It was just a very interesting pair there. Kiffen, who's Orthodox, and Biddle, who's an actual heretic, being tried under the same law. Very interesting. Under the same ordinance. In 1642, about 13 years earlier, Kiffen was indicted on at least two occasions, one for not attending his local parish and two for attending an illegal meeting. So they were watching these Baptists. They were keeping an eye on them. The state was. And, you didn't attend your local parish. You didn't go to your local Church of England, right? Your local parish. Oh, we're taking attendance. Well, William Kiffen's not on the attendance sheet for this week, so we got to go arrest him. We got to go try him. They made sure people attended their local churches. And then for attending an illegal meeting, which probably, if I had to guess, was a congregation of other similar minded or like minded believers, Baptist believers, and that would have been considered an illegal meeting. But notwithstanding all of that, Kiffen would become a very wealthy man. So wealthy, in fact, that he claimed to have lent Charles II 40,000 pounds in their time, which would have been about, and I did some research, I think it was about 8 million US dollars in our time. That's a lot of money. And Kiffen became very wealthy because he became a merchant. And he got himself into the trades as a brewer, and apparently he worked his way up as a merchant, became very wealthy for himself. This highlights how wealthy he had become over time, and he was actually apparently so wealthy and well known, apparently in among the rich, that King Charles II took note of him and asked to borrow money from him. And there is some debate as to whether it was 40,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds. But either way, he lent money to King Charles II. So it just highlights how much, even in their state as Baptists, how some of these men at the civil level had such an influence upon the land that they were in. They weren't ostracized necessarily. Some of them had deep connections in government. They had deep connections in government, and they used it to their advantage, or at least tried to. They didn't run for the hills just because they were Baptists and they were being persecuted. They had to provide for their families, provide themselves, live a peaceful and quiet life. And Kiffen, by God's grace, was able to become wealthy by becoming a merchant. And in Kiffen's case, with those close ties in politics, it does seem that he played a large role in British politics at the parliamentary level. He became an MP for Middlesex in 1656 and was directly involved in the Naylor case. If you, I can't remember if we talked about this on the show before, but James Naylor was a Quaker who did a reenactment of Jesus Christ entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, or the triumphal entry as it's known. He reenacted that and was arrested for it because it was considered blasphemy to do that. And Kiffen was involved in that. And interestingly enough, Kiffen wanted to see Naylor punished. There were people in Parliament who were proposing for Naylor's death for blaspheming Christ, but Kiffen said, no, I think that's a bit too harsh. But he certainly wanted him punished. He was very much in favor of that. And Naylor would actually go on to be severely punished. Whether Kiffen advocated for the specific punishment, I don't know, But he said explicitly that he wanted some lesser punishment for Naylor for his blasphemy. But Naylor ended up being punished severely. One of the punishments being he had his tongue bored in all the way through. So basically, they hammered something through his tongue as one of his punishments. They didn't take public blasphemy, lightly back then. It was a wicked thing. It's still a wicked thing, and we should punish it as a civil government. That's the ideal place to be in. But it just highlights at that time how very serious these things were taken, how God's name was to be revered, how Christ was to be revered, and this was not to be taken lightly. So he played a pretty big role in that. Another interesting note as it relates to Kiffen's financial endeavors, his business endeavors, Kiffen went on a business venture in the Bahamas with John Locke. Now, those of you who know your American history, that name should start perking up your ears. John Locke is known for presenting ideas that were used for the founding of the United States. So Kiffen was actually a business partner with him, interestingly enough. And also, Kiffen was involved in the slave trade in some sense. He was involved in slave plantations and apparently had no problem with slavery, just like everybody at the time had no problem with slavery. But I just thought that was an interesting note. But among other things, Kiffen, he helped defend against the Seekers and Quakers. He was quite involved in addressing issues, again, like with Naylor. And there's another incident that we've talked about on the show before where Kiffen had to kind of help facilitate and mediate conflict between a friend of particular Baptists and William Penn, and had to deal with Quaker falsehoods and things like that. He signed the First and London Baptist Confessions. And in fact, he signed all 5 editions of the First London. And I think this, him being a signer of all 5 editions of the First London and being a signer of the second shows his theological consistency. He wasn't all over the place in his theology. He was a leader in this movement and a consistent theologian with its theology, pushing it forward, not faltering in terms of particular Baptist theology. He signed all 5 editions, one of the few that did, and the Second London, and was involved in the 1689 General Assembly, at least. Just always there on these major events and using his gifts to serve Christ's church. It's really neat to see that. He was also an early proponent among particular Baptists against infant baptism. Kiffen would die in 1701, so he lived quite a long time, 1616 to 1701. He was elderly when he passed away. But he had such a strong legacy as a prominent particular Baptist. He led his brethren through thick and thin, and that makes him probably the most notable of all the particular Baptists of this time. That's not to say that other particular Baptists who were involved in the First and Second London Confessions didn't do hard work or weren't notable, but Kiffen just stands out because he's just always there on these major events, and the consistency of his theology and the apparent leadership that he took in trying to legitimize particular Baptist theology. It is really, really neat. Sola Gratia 2010. Hello, Brother Daniel. It's nice to finally watch a live episode. It's been a long time. Well, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining, and I hope it's a blessing to you. and I appreciate your kind words and support. I hope it's edifying to you. But with Kiffin, again, he just was such a prominent particular Baptist, given, I think, because of his ties politically, his wealth, and the consistency that he had in particular Baptist theology. He's always there. He seems to be leading the charge on critical issues. So there's some lessons I think we can learn from his life. One, that wealth can be of great advantage to the church, be a great advantage to the church. Wealth is not wicked. It's not evil. It can be used for God's church. And I think that we can see that Kiffin did that in supporting his brethren, in using his status to help support his brethren. He also demonstrates further the consensus view among particular Baptists of the time that government must enforce the first table of the law. We see this with the Naylor situation. The Quaker, he had no problem with the government punishing public blasphemy. He had no problem with that. And it also demonstrates practically that particular Baptists did not believe in separating themselves from government, or that it was an evil institution, as Anabaptists had taught. I mean, he served in government. He was an MP, and he had no problem being friends with King Charles II and buddying up to some of those in power. Remember, strict Anabaptists were very much against government. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see the strong emphasis throughout particular Baptist history in the 17th century. You see this constant drumbeat of, we're not trying to start an insurrection. We respect the king. We respect government. We want to submit to government in as much as they are telling us to do what is pleasing to God. Otherwise, we won't. They did not want to show themselves as seditious or as problematic. They wanted to be very clear that God has told us that we are to be submissive to government. Again, in contrast to the Anabaptists, who thought government was evil and that Christians should not serve in government, that government was just an evil institution that should not be submitted to, right? And the particular Baptists are like, no, that's not us. We're not those people over there. We believe in the legitimacy of government, and we will obey. So you see that very clear. You see that in the First and Second London Confessions, and they're clearly trying to distance themselves from Anabaptist theology on that matter. So Kiffen, is a perfect practical example of what particular Baptist theology looked like in that. I mean, doctrine was seen as worth losing wealth and life over. Again, with Kiffen being hounded early on by the government for, you didn't go to your local parish, you attended a legal meeting, you're preaching that infant baptism is unlawful. They persevered. He did not change his tune just because the government was pestering him. He continued to persist and follow his conscience as it was bound to the word of God in worship and what is a biblical church. I mean, these guys literally their theology was refined in fire. Refined. It's easy for us today to look back and go, wow, that's incredible. And, and be able to have the wealth of knowledge that we have today and be able to read what they had and use that to inform our theology and our practice and to adjust as needed. They had to do this under fire. They had to do this under persecution. And yet they persevered. God was gracious to the particular Baptists and helped many of them to persevere. So doctrine was seen as something that was worth dying for. That should be sobering to us. And in Kiffin's mind, God's word would be supreme. And like Solomon, God blessed Kiffin with material wealth, which did not make him forget his brethren. He was not aloof of his particular Baptist brethren. He helped them. He helped guide them through these murky waters as they got themselves settled in England. And he was a strong advocate for the financial support of ministers so they could live by the gospel. I was actually just reading a work that he signed along with Hansard Knowles and William Collins and other particular Baptists, talking about the importance of providing for a minister, providing for the needs of a minister as he is set aside to preach the gospel and minister to the people of God. Very sobering and very helpful, I think. And I'll read a little bit of it here. It says, quote, "And indeed it seems to us a thing grievous as well as strange that any people should be so clouded in their understanding as in the least to doubt whether it be duty or not that the church should allow a due maintenance to their faithful pastors and teachers. Yet we hear there are not only some who have doubts about it, but others who seem to object and stiffly argue against it as if it were unlawful, if not anti-Christian, for ministers to receive yearly or quarterly allowance from the churches, amongst whom they are placed and employed as laborers, which conceit cannot be without its sad effects and consequences. And if they are not convinced of this mistaken error, the sooner may be in a little time appear to the more palpable detriment and prejudice of the gospel and a reproach of profession." You can hear the strong language that it's weird that people are so clouded in their understandings that, and apparently there were those who were saying that it was unlawful, or at least implied that it was unlawful to that ministers should receive due maintenance, as they call it, from their church. Definitely something today that we, I think, take for granted or don't think enough about at all is how the importance of providing just the material for the material needs of our pastors so they don't have to be distracted. So that was something that weighed heavy on particular Baptists in general, but clearly Kiffin had a heart for that. And it's interesting, him being very wealthy and having a heart for this, right? So I can imagine he financially was supportive of his particular Baptist brethren where needed or where he felt he should do that. So very interesting things coming out of that. As we kind of finish up here, an interesting factoid I found when I was putting this together. Kiffin's granddaughter, he had multiple children. I don't remember the exact number. Kiffin's granddaughter married Oliver Cromwell's grandson. I thought that was an interesting family tie. And what's interesting is Oliver Cromwell's son, Henry, who took over for him, did not like Baptists. And so I think if Cromwell's son knew that, if Henry knew that his son was marrying a Baptist descendant, he probably would not have been happy about that. But I thought that was a really interesting factoid that Kiffin has this distant relation with Oliver Cromwell through marriage. But yeah, all kinds of interesting historical stuff. Let's see. Tifbeth 12. Why do some people embrace the first London Baptist Confession but not the second one? That is a good question. I understand there are those that do. The only reason I can think of is they see some sort of substantial difference between the two. And they think that if you're embracing the first, there must be enough differences between that and the second that they are convinced is better or more biblical than the Second London. I don't know if they would throw it out entirely, but there are those who do prefer the First London to the Second, even though there isn't any substantial difference between them. Yes, the Second London, in some ways, I think is clearer and articulates theology better, but the fundamental orthodoxy of the faith is there. And actually, years ago, we had an episode with Jim Renahan where we talked about this issue specifically on whether there is a substantial difference between the First and the Second London Baptist Confessions of Faith. So I would encourage you to go look back in the archive and find that. I don't remember when it is. It was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But we interviewed him and he talked about that specifically on, is there substantial difference between the First and Second London Baptist Confession of Faith? Short answer, Jim said no, but it's an interesting discussion nonetheless. But clearly those who hold to the First London as opposed to the Second thinks there is a substantial difference between those two confessions. So I think that's why. From the specific theological points where they would find difference between them, I don't know that. That would be an interesting study, actually. Maybe that could be an episode. I don't know if I can find some information on that. But good question nonetheless. It's definitely, it definitely makes you scratch your head and go, why are they holding that confession when we have one that's a bit more concise and clear and I think presents a much more mature theology, even though in some ways, I find some aspects of the First London maybe a little bit better than the Second, that dives into certain topics maybe a little bit more clear. You can find, I'm sure you can find different places where that might be the case. But thank you for the question. Sola Gratia 2010 said, this is Petty France church member Kyle. Oh, I heard it's an issue on Sabbath why most churches hold the first instead of the... Kyle, welcome. Thank you for... you are. So now I'll remember when I see that YouTube handle, I'll know who's popping in here. I heard it's an issue on Sabbath why most churches hold to the first instead of the second. Interesting. I'll have to look at what the first says about the Sabbath versus the second. I can't imagine it's substantially different. I'll have to look, and I'll have to look at which edition too. Again, there's 5 editions of the First London, so it'd be interesting to see on the point of the Sabbath, are there differences between the different editions on the Sabbath, and then look at all of those differences and compare it to the second. I don't know. I'll have to go and look at that, but that's a very interesting reason to find difference. But I wonder if the first is less Sabbatarian seeming than the second. I don't know. I'll have to do a deep dive into that more. Kyle, sounds like maybe that is a future episode. That would actually be a really interesting comparison to do. All right. Wow, we got some good interaction in the chat today. I always love it when people put comments in the chat, gets discussion going, answer any questions you have. But I think that's all we have for today. I'm gonna have to go get some dinner here. But I appreciate everyone tuning in. Appreciate the comments. Appreciate the questions. Appreciate the super chat, Federal Theology. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and Lord's Day tomorrow. And God willing, we'll be back next week. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube where you can find more of our podcast content. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.